Yay!
Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. This is actually the second take I was doing for this video because it is a little bit difficult to get my new equipment set up, but we're gonna figure it out, don't worry. I'm sorry that I haven't updated in so long. My life fell apart twice in the past 2 years since I last did a video / live stream, but I got on some new meds, I got a new haircut, and also a new outlook on life. I've been able to write a lot because of this new outlook on life, meaning I have to read a lot because it is important to your writing career that you often read books. It's good to get your TV shows, your video games, your music, your movies in as well, but if you're writing novels, you need to read novels. I am going to be rating every book that I read in 2025 from worst to best. Obviously, spoilers for all these books. I will be using this review chart right here in order to help me. That's just so that I have some objective measure by which to judge these books. I know that opinions can't be completely objective, but sometimes when you're using a 5-star ranking system, people can get a little salty. I will be making some of these books into separate videos because this is just a brief overview, so if you disagree with my opinions or you're very salty about them or whatever else, please withhold those complaints until the reviews for those are out. For ones that I don't want to make separate videos on, please feel free to destroy me, or don't. I would really prefer that. Our first 1-star is going to be Tim Keller's Counterfeit Gods. I read this in August and I put it down and then I picked it up in December. This book is about idols in our lives, specifically non-conventional idols, aka anything that is not a block of wood, as is the traditional biblical definition. I am going to make this into a separate video because I think it's an important topic, so hang tight if you don't like my thoughts. Just know that I respect Tim Keller's work. He does other good things from what I have heard. I am just trying to rate this book as a self-contained thing. There are some positives. There are some decent examples of biblical and real-world idolatry. I think of Nebuchadnezzar and possibly Naaman, although he doesn't go into the very obvious idolatry of Naaman in that he was actually worshipping other gods while he was looking for a cure to his leprosy. Zacchaeus is another good example of somebody who idolized money and the tax collecting class in Roman society in general. I also like that he had an analysis of Joseph and Leah's character arcs. That was pretty cool to see. Those are the positives for me, but there are mostly negatives, as you may have guessed. There's an extremely broad definition of idolatry in this book. It could trigger those with religious scrupulosity pretty hard. I can testify that this was a difficult book to get through, as that is a personal struggle of mine. He makes the definition of idolatry so broad that anything and everything could be an idol, and he decides to go the route to avoid dealing with the implications of this by saying that you can demote these idols into their proper place in your life as long as you keep God first and foremost. But that is not the biblical prescription for idolatry. The biblical prescription of idolatry is that the good kings of Israel were commended for smashing the Asherah poles, for desecrating the altars on the high places. They were not merely demoted below God, they were destroyed and removed completely from these people's lives. Secondly, Tim Keller has a poor understanding of trauma and mental health. He often blames abuse victims and those who suffer from mental illness of being idolaters if they struggle with, for example, staying with their abuser, still wanting their abuser's approval, being in and out of psych wards, struggling with suicidal ideation, things like that. He defines an idol as anything where if you lost it, your life would not be worth living anymore, which is not the biblical definition of idolatry. There are certain prophets who struggled with that, and God didn't call them idolaters. He came alongside them and comforted them, gave them things to eat in the case of Elijah, and generally helped them through their feelings rather than condemning them as idolaters. Finally, there is too much reliance on historical imagination with Abraham, Joseph, and Jonah. Some of the things he has in this book are straight up not true, such as framing Abraham as an idolater when he's only portrayed as righteous in the passage where he sacrifices Isaac. I don't understand that, and this is coming from an Abraham critic who believes that the situation with Hagar was dubiously consensual at best. I don't like that very much. It's the same thing with Joseph wanting to marry a woman so much that you do 7 years of hard labor for somebody. That was normal for the time. That was not idolatry. Jonah was the same way. He says that Jonah changed because somebody had to have written the book of Jonah. I completely agree that it is possible Jonah changed, but we don't have enough information in that in the biblical text, and that kind of seems like a reach to me. I would not recommend this book. I think that The Mystery by Lacey Sturm, which I will be reviewing later in this video, does a much better job at addressing the topic of idolatry, specifically when it comes to codependency, which Tim Keller attempted but ultimately failed at. We also have only one 2-star, and that is Shepherds for Sale by Megan Basham. I read this book in March and then put it down because I disliked it, and then I picked it back up in December and finished it on audio. This book is about how major evangelical institutions and leaders have sold out to the political and progressive left wing. I will make this into a separate video as well. It will need a ton of research, so that one may take a while, just bear with me. Positives: there is a solidly biblical worldview in a lot of areas. I agree with some of her politics, obviously not all of them. I do have some major issues with the studies that she cites and the people that she cites, and there are several verifiable examples of maybe not sellouts, but concerning examples of people who have compromised in the church, major leaders who have compromised in the church. Finally, there is an interesting testimony of Megan Basham's at the end, and I think the message that she gives in her testimony is quite good, of not remaining in a victim mentality just because you have been abused or mistreated or whatever else. This book does have some pretty awful negatives in it, though. Her thesis is defended pretty poorly. It is about how evangelical leaders have sold out, but in practice it's a mixture of these people are compromising and I don't like it, which is partially valid in a different book, and these people disagree with me on secondary issues and I don't like it. Some examples of compromisers who there is no evidence that they have actually sold out, just that they have incorrect biblical views on certain things, are Andy Stanley and Preston Sprinkle. And then some examples of people who validly disagree with Megan Basham and aren't compromised in any way in their faith, that she still found fit to slander and or complain about, are Gavin Ortland and possibly N.T. Wright as well. I need to do more research on this. Gavin Ortland made a good defense of his views and how she misrepresented them in her book, so I will leave that down in the description. The tone of this book is also rather ugly. She has a lot of ad hominems toward her opponents and even toward normal people who disagree with her. There are a lot of comments on people's clothing, their appearance, their tone of voice, and other things that just come off as unnecessary and rude, especially when most of these people did nothing to wrong her personally and aren't generally ugly people. They just don't hold the same worldview as her. That was pretty gross. Finally, she has a poor understanding of trauma when it comes to sexual assault and abuse. This would be in her chapter on the Me Too and Church Too movements. Megan Basham is a victim of rape, so I definitely don't want to discount her experience or say that she just doesn't know what she's talking about or that she's getting offended on others' behalves, because she has suffered from this herself. But some of the psychology and some of the people that she cites are incorrect, and any licensed counselor could tell you that these things are incorrect. For example, she discounts the existence of dissociative amnesia, and then the idea that there are 3 other responses to being raped besides fight, which are flight, freeze, and fawn. And that was pretty weird to me. You don't need to use physical force to rape somebody. You can use the threat of financial loss, of emotional abandonment, of the Bible even, like 1 Corinthians 7. That is also pretty dangerous. And The biggest issue that I have with this book is that the research is quite poor, and it's not something where you can figure that out just by reading the text of the page. You do have to do a lot of outside research to dig into this. I would not recommend this book. I think that it is quite ugly and disrespectful, and her attitude defending her actions instead of simply owning up to them on social media, that does not make this any better. So now we're getting into the 3 stars. There are actually 2 3 stars that I'm going to review together because they are by the same team, and these books are called She Deserves Better: Raising Girls to Resist Toxic Teachings on Sex, Self, and Speaking Up by Sheila Gregoire, Rebecca Gregoire Lindenbach, and Joanna Sawatsky, as well as The Marriage You Want by the same authors. I read these between May and June and absolutely adored them all, but for one thing. In She Deserves Better, it is just one thing, but it is such a big issue that I believe it would be unwise to recommend this book, particularly as a method of Christian teaching. That being said, I do think Bare Marriage does a lot of great work in exposing the extreme complementarianism and patriarchalism in the evangelical church, but I do not listen to them or endorse them because of the book, specifically She Deserves Better. So let's talk about it. Almost everything about these books is positive, specifically She Deserves Better. It is so important that girls understand biblical teachings on modesty and sex and sexual assault and all of those other things that women deal with. I am blown away by their studies in both of these books and in general, and I believe that they have done great work in the evangelical sphere. That being said, there's one glaring issue running throughout both She Deserves Better and their entire ministry, to the point where I would not recommend any of their books. That is that they do incredibly poor research in the LGBTQ infographics in She Deserves Better. They briefly quote the Trevor Project, which is an organization and not a peer-reviewed medical journal. This is something we learned in grade school not to do, is that you don't quote organizations, you quote medical studies, which is very strange to me from so-called researchers who are looking into these issues. The studies that the Trevor Project cites are pretty dang awful as well, and thus it fails in a critical area in such a serious way that Bare Marriage is disqualified as a Christian ministry. And that is because Christian leaders, whether they be pastors or authors or speakers or parachurch ministers, they must hold to a biblical sexual ethic. The Bible is very clear that homosexual and transgender behavior, yes, including willful fantasy, they are sinful. And when you aren't clear about your perspective and you quote a gay-affirming organization that permits gay boys to talk to random gay men online without their parents' knowledge or consent, that's a problem. A leader must be sexually moral, and they fail in this area. The poor research methods as well, while I don't believe that they undermine all of the good work that they've done, they put a damper on it and they call it into question. If you can't even be bothered to either make your own study or even look up the actual medical studies that would point to your position, what does that say about your other research methods? Why should I trust you? Like I said, I will be making a separate video on this and on all their books probably in that same video because I believe that they are important to discuss. I do not recommend any of these books, but it's not because they don't have good messages or anything good within them, but because I would not trust these people as solid Christian leaders, particularly since they have promoted gay-affirming thought leaders in the church, such as Pete Enns, Preston Sprinkle, Andy Stanley, and Ruth Everhart, to name a few. And I believe that they still do good work, but I cannot respect them as Christian ministers. Next, we have All the Scary Little Gods, a memoir by Natalie Hoffman. I read this in November and a little bit in December. I got recommended it from the Bare Marriage podcast. And this book is a memoir about Natalie Hoffman's escape from the Gothardist cult. I will make a separate video on this one as well, and not all of these videos are going to be negative. There's a lot to like about this book, but there are a lot of problems with it as well. The first part is told from the perspective of young Natalie. The second part is told from the perspective of her internal family system, and the third part is told from Natalie in the present day. I found that very interesting, and it was very healing to my inner child as somebody who is a victim of abuse. And it has great critiques of the Gothardist movement in the extremes of complementarianism. Not all complementarians are extreme, but some hyper-complementarians are, and this book does a great job at calling them out. However, that's going to be a running theme in this video. Hoffman is New Thought, and again, this is a situation where there's a lot to love about this book, but there's a lot that could be desired, especially when it comes to grading a memoir. You can't grade a memoir based on the true story aspect because you can't change what actually literally happened, but you can control what messages you're spreading through your memoir, and she is spreading those of the New Thought movement. I have included Melissa Doherty's channel in the description box because she does a way better job at confronting the New Thought movement than I could ever hope to do, and I've been binge watching all of her videos. I really appreciate them, but New Thought is a heretical group. She seems to be a universalist as well. She quotes Greg Boyd, and she's not very clear about her stances on homosexual behavior either. This is one of those things where I would recommend it if you want a story, but not if you want a message. Next up is Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood by Aimee Byrd, and the subtitle is How the Church Needs to Rediscover Her Purpose. I read this in December, and it is a response to John Piper and Wayne Grudem's Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood book. And this book confronts the bad teachings that women are given, and specifically how the church has pushed out women in favor of this hyper-complementarian thought pattern. I am an egalitarian, full disclosure, although I'm not one of the crazy ones, as you may have guessed. We'll make a separate video on this, but just so you know, my critique of this book and of The Marriage You Want, and of She Deserves Better, and of all the rest of these books on this list is coming from an egalitarian perspective. Positives, very good real-world applications for her points. Aimee Byrd was a complementarian when she wrote this, although at the time she didn't prefer the term. She preferred to describe herself as one who holds to male ordination, which it's kind of the same thing. I appreciate the nuance, but I am reductive, so I will be calling her a complementarian. This book is very friendly and gentle toward both egalitarians and complementarians. I think that both could agree with a lot of the messages in this book. There are also a lot of interesting points about the original biblical languages and historical context to consider, and she's very good at drawing out the problems in the hypercomplementarian sphere. There are some negatives to this book, however. She has too much reliance on historical imagination, specifically when it comes to Mary and Martha, and she quotes scholars such as Philip Payne who are very irresponsible with the biblical text. I will be leaving a link down in the description to Mike Winger's Women in Ministry series. Obviously, I don't completely agree with it, as I am an egalitarian, but he does do a very good job at exposing the exaggerations and the lies and the distortions of scripture from many of these top egalitarian scholars. I would highly recommend his work. Not every scholar he quotes is a bad one. Obviously, he quotes N.T. Wright, who I love, but he is a very good resource on criticisms, even if I don't agree with his conclusions. She does have some poorer arguments, even from otherwise solid scholars, such as N.T. Wright's Apostles to the Apostles argument, and the idea that Huldah canonized the Torah or something like that. That's a little bit strange. And she does have some strange theology on some very major issues. Sometimes she seems to suggest that Christ is insufficient without the church, which that would be heretical if that's actually what she believes. I get the sense that that's not what she believes, but there are some weird phrasings at the very least in that book. I would still recommend this book, but I would recommend it with caveats, and I would encourage you to use critical thinking as you read it. Alright, now we're getting into the 4 stars. These are the books that I would recommend even though they have some major flaws. The first 2 that I'm going to be reviewing together is Hitler's Cross, How the Cross Was Used to Promote the Nazi Agenda, and When a Nation Forgets God, 7 Lessons We Must Learn from Nazi Germany, both by Erwin W. Lutzer. These books I read in October. The latter is a condensed version of the former, and I didn't realize that till I finished them both. so I'll be reviewing them together. I do recommend these books. If you are interested in a deep dive, get Hitler's Cross. If you're interested in a brief read, get When a Nation Forgets God. These books are both about how Hitler co-opted Christianity during World War II and how the church in Germany largely fell for it. I think that they're pretty good, but I have one major issue with them, and I think this warrants a separate video, so I will be doing that later on. But first, the positives. This is a very insightful historical analysis overall. I really like how it debunks the idea that Hitler was a Christian. That's the talking point from non-believers and skeptics online, is the idea that Hitler was a Christian, so how could Christianity be good or true? He was not a Christian. He was a heretic through and through. And this is very evident if you look at even the bare basics of Nazi Germany and what the Nazis were doing and saying behind the scenes. He also discusses the verbally abusive tactics of the loudest voices in the LGBTQ community, both back when he was writing and right now. By this, I don't mean that LGBTQ people are more likely to be verbally abusive than the general population, but rather that there are some manipulation tactics and emotional abuse tactics that some of the thought leaders throughout history have implemented, such as the idea that if you do not approve of all their actions, ideas, or conduct, that you are somehow a bigot, a hateful person, a bad person. That is very effective on a lot of people, and some of the original leaders said that they took these rhetorical tactics from Adolf Hitler, how they have to portray their position as the moral one. It is controversial and not politically correct, but I highly recommend giving the book a chance because it makes some good points. There was one big negative that I can think of, and that's that Lutzer's theology of suffering is not very good in these books. I think that there's a problem in Christianity with the martyr complex, the idea that we should be seeking out martyrdom experiences, and that if we are not suffering or paying some cost for our faith in the present moment, that we are somehow false Christians, lukewarm Christians, backsliders, or even going to hell. That's a very strange idea. The Bible emphasizes the good things about pleasures in life constantly, and Lutzer seems to take the opposite position that I mentioned earlier, along with some of the people he quotes, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Obviously, that's not Lutzer's fault, it's the framing that matters. When a Nation Forgets God has a foreword by Ravi Zacharias as well, who is a disqualified leader to the nth degree. I mean, that's insane. If you somehow don't already know about Ravi Zacharias' behavior, I would recommend checking out Mike Winger's analysis. He goes through the whole report. That will be in the description box below. That is not Lutzer's fault. He wrote this book in the 90s, and it is not his fault that Ravi did the things that he did. There is evidence that even the board members at RZIM didn't know what Ravi was doing, so I do not count that against this book. I would recommend this book for anybody interested in Nazi Germany who is able to stomach some of the more politically incorrect claims made in the book. Next up, we have Save Me From Myself, How I Found God, Quit Corn, Kicked Drugs, and Lived to Tell My Story by Brian Head Welch. This is the guy from Korn. He is still with Korn, and he also has a band called Love and Death. I read this in February, and this is a book about how the lead guitarist of the metal group Korn became a believer and about his struggle with drug addiction, abuse, and other terrible, terrible things. I'm a metalhead. I do not listen to Korn. I do not listen to any of this person's things. I am interested, though, after reading this book. I will be making a glowing review on this book. And the positives are overwhelming in this book. He goes through so much of his story and what influenced him to go down the path that he did, and about really how, in a way, he was a victim of his audience and of the recording industry. There are a plethora of problems in the recording industry, especially in that kind of hard death metal scene. And in a way, the audience and the industry were enabling this selfish behavior. He was mutually abusive with his girlfriend. He was addicted to meth and tried so many times to get off of it and just couldn't. But then he found Jesus and he was able to quit. And I think that's an important story to tell. This book also changed my view radically on the nature of suicide. Prior to reading this book, I didn't necessarily believe in the idea of selfish suicides. I believed that suicide was mostly caused by mental illness, not that it can't be mental illness and selfish, but that it's primarily mental illness, and people don't just commit suicide to get back at people or to get people to feel sorry for them or to manipulate them. This changed my view quite a bit because in the beginning of the book, Welch talks about how he was on the verge of committing suicide so that people would feel sorry for him like they felt sorry for all the other dead rock stars who committed suicide, think like Kurt Cobain. And it actually shifted my view just a tiny bit regarding Shadow Weaver's death. Now, I'm not a fan of the death. Anybody who knows me for any amount of time will know that. I'm actually thinking of redoing the series I did a long time ago on that death, just in a better and brighter way. Only negative that I think I have with this book is that he's not very eloquent. Sometimes he makes these grave theological errors that lean more into heresy, but I believe that they are accidental. For example, he said that Jesus was half man and half God, which is a heresy known as Nestorianism, and he said that the Trinity is the three parts of God, which is the heresy of partialism. That is an accident, I am convinced, based on other things that he said. He's a very normal Pentecostal Trinitarian Christian from everything that I can gather otherwise. So this is not a knock on him, but this might be a difficult thing for the general audience to wrestle with. I would recommend this book overall. Just recognize some of the phrasing he uses in the book is not as it should be. Next up, we have Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions by Greg Koukl. I reread this in July. I first read this book in 2021. This book is written to Christians about how to actually listen to people they disagree with instead of self-righteously pontificating all the time, so I think that it's worth reading even if you are not a Christian. I think that both Christians and non-Christians can very much benefit from this book and the methodology he uses for discussing your beliefs. He is not a huge fan of altar calls, and he's not a huge fan of certain meaningless liturgical language that doesn't register well with people outside the church. He does so much free work on the topic of tactics that I don't feel the need to make a separate video analyzing the book because his work is just that good. So I'm going to leave a link down to his YouTube channel in the description box, so you guys can feel free to check that out as well. Positives. Very user-friendly. Most of the things in this book, both Christians and non-Christians can benefit from because it's mostly about methodology. It's written from a Christian perspective and it has a clear bias toward Christianity, but I really think that anybody can learn from the things that he talks about in this book related to asking good questions, like, what do you mean by that? How did you arrive at that conclusion? And kind of steering the conversation and talking about things that really just don't make sense to you. So I really appreciated that. I felt that it was very interesting. It's good at teaching critical thinking too and some basic logical fallacies. Christians need to engage with logic, reason, and evidence. This is something that the evangelical church has neglected very much in the past 100 years or so, and it is a huge problem. I don't really understand exactly why people say that he's condescending either in this book or in Street Smarts, because he is just such a gentle person in this book. I suppose that you could say that saying, well, I'm confused, when you actually have a tangible problem with what your conversation partner is saying, I can see how that might come off the wrong way, but you don't have to be condescending when you say, I'm confused. He's a very warm person, and I do very much like the bulk of this book. The only negative I have is that some examples, such as against theistic evolution, which I hold to, are not very good. He doesn't seem to understand my position very well, nor the position of prominent theistic evolutionists, and sometimes when you focus on these secondary issues too much, it can create needless division in the church, and I think that some of the examples that he gives in other areas just simply aren't very good. Do not take my recommendation of this book as an endorsement of literally everything in it. And that goes for all of these books, honestly. If I don't mention a critique, that doesn't mean that I don't have it or I wouldn't recognize it. These are just my off the top of my head thoughts, initial thoughts before I do my deeper reviews. All that to say, highly recommend this book. Just use your brain. You might hear me say that a couple of times otherwise in this video. Next up is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. I read this in June and July. I actually did not reread this one. It is a brand new one, obviously, because Wind and Truth just came out. Wait a second, no it didn't. It came out a year ago! What? In which the squad of Shallan, Dalinar, Kaladin, and Adolin and Navani, they face off with Odium. Dalinar has made his oath with Odium of the Contest of Champions, and that's all that there is in this story to enjoy. This book concludes the Stormlight series, or at least the first half of it, rather, and it is a fantastic book. It kept me on the edge of the seat the entire time. I had a lot of fun with it. It made me feel all the feelings, every single one of them. And I will not be mentioning the ending of it because it is so good that I don't want to spoil it completely. I will make a separate video on this because I am a little bit conflicted on it in several major ways. But first, the positives. Brandon Sanderson has a crazy talent of pulling off things that sound terrible on paper, but actually work really well when you put them into practice. And I'm not sure how he does it. It's some sort of Brandon Sanderson magic I just can't seem to figure out yet. Character arcs were really good, with the exception of Shallan's. I have some bones to pick with that one. Otherwise, I loved Kaladin's arc, Zeth's arc. They're amazing. I even like Yasna's arc. I don't understand exactly why people have a problem with her debate with Odium. That is a little bit strange to me. I liked it. I thought it was a great introduction to her arc in the back half. I appreciate how it deconstructed her arrogance, and I hope to see more of her in the back half of the series. Now, for some negatives. Like I said, I do have a bone to pick with Shallan's arc. I felt like it was a bit all over the place upon my first reading. Maybe that will change when I read it again for my deeper dive into it, but it didn't land exactly for me. I also had an issue with the LGBTQ rep. Not that it exists. I'm well aware that LGBTQ people exist and that non-Christians also exist, and that people are going to explore certain things in ways that I don't always personally agree with as a Christian. I felt that it was shoehorned in, and honestly, if I were part of the community, I would find parts of it, specifically with R'Ellaine and Renarin, rather offensive. I will get into more detail about that in my next video, so please hang tight if this opinion bothers you. I apologize for the brevity of my thoughts. This is just my off-the-cuff thought on this. Finally, the pacing was pretty bad. There were too many points of view that I didn't care about. I felt that Brandon Sanderson introduced too many characters in this midpoint story, and I understand that some authors can pull it off. I have done it myself, but it is very hard to do, and I felt like it didn't quite land. In spite of this, however, this book was incredible. I overall really enjoy it. I highly recommend it, and the rest of the Stormlight series. It is a worthy conclusion to the first half of the Stormlight archive. Next up is The Horse and His Boy by C.S. Lewis. I reread this in November, but it's been so long since I read it that it's basically a new read. I think the last time I read Narnia was when I was 7, so it's been a while. This is a story about how a Narnian boy named Shasta escapes from Calormen with a talking horse. And I'm a huge fan of C.S. Lewis's work, all of it, albeit with some serious disagreements on his view of women. More on that later. I will make a separate video on this one because I think it's important to talk about the toxic views of divine discipline that Christians often have, and unfortunately that shows itself in this book. Positives, though, first. World building is phenomenal. I love anything involving Calormen or the other lands besides Narnia. I find them super interesting and exciting to explore. I do not think that the portrayal of Calormen in this book, or in The Last Battle for that matter, is racist. There is a long and documented history of cultures of people of color around the world that are openly preferential of white people. I even know a family friend whose parents weren't even subtle about it. They wanted him to marry a white person because whiteness is associated with wealth and prosperity and beauty and all that stuff in places like India and the Middle East. Not saying it's good, but it is normal for cultures to think that way. And that is accurately portrayed, as well as the connections to Islam and the Eastern religions. I will get into that more in my longer video. There's also a lot of good character development and theming in this book. Aravis's arc is super good, even though I have some bones to pick with it, and I appreciate the way that she grows throughout the story from kind of cold-hearted in order to survive to becoming gentle because she no longer has to survive, she can actually live and thrive. Finally, as I said, a lot of good humor and commentary on the Middle Eastern world. C.S. Lewis did do his research into the radical sects of Islam, and I think that that shines through. There's a lot of use of Calorman poetry to symbolize Quranic sayings. Alright, and now for the negatives. I do have one major negative regarding this book, and that is the whole thing with Aslan and Aravis. It does read like victim blaming. It goes into that toxic idea of God as waiting to strike you down, enjoying your suffering. It shouldn't be in the church. That's not a biblical understanding of the way that God uses bad circumstances in our lives. Still recommend this book, just recognize that Aslan's portrayal in here is not an accurate portrayal of the Christian God. Alright, and now on to the complete 8-book Ramona collection by Beverly Cleary. I read this in September. This is a series about a young girl who has to deal with young girl things as somebody who feels different than everybody else. I read these books when I was 7 or 8. They were my childhood. I really liked them, so I wanted to see if they held up by adult standards and by general good literary standards. So I'm reviewing it as one set because the books are so short. They're less than an hour each on Kindle, so I felt the need to condense it down, but I liked all of them pretty equally for what it's worth. Ramona's a really good unintentional portrayal of a neurodivergent kid. I find it so funny how she doesn't understand how her parents feel. She struggles with social cues. She tends to gravitate more toward boys than girls in her friendships. She struggles with social things at school, and she has meltdowns, and she has special interests that she just can't stop enjoying. And I felt that it was very similar to my experience growing up as a kid with undiagnosed autism and ADHD. Struggles are relatable as well to someone with sad kid syndrome, which I had growing up and which I will be talking about more in the future and even later in this video. I can relate to her feeling as though she is the less loved child because she's younger and because she has stronger emotions than her sister. And it is a very funny series in general. I think that Beverly Cleary has such good humor. There are negatives, though. Not a lot of plot in some of the books, and being a kids' series is not an excuse for that. As we see with Narnia and as we see with a lot of other series, you can have deep stories in kids' media. Sometimes there's just not a lot of plot, it meanders back and forth, and sometimes I got to the end of the book and I was like, I feel like there wasn't exactly a climax here. As well as this, sometimes Beverly Cleary isn't good at acknowledging when the grown-ups mess up, and some of the phrasing of the messages in the books can be a little bit strange. It hasn't aged as well as I wish it did. I still recommend this series for adults and children alike, and I think that it overall holds up, especially if you read it to your kids as a bedtime story. Next up is Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis. I reread this book in December, but again, I read it when I was 7, so I didn't remember it all that well, especially since the movie is not very accurate to the book. This is a story about Narnia 400 years after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in which a false ruler named Miraz takes the throne of Narnia, and his nephew Caspian has to reclaim it as the rightful king. Positives. I love that C.S. Lewis emphasizes feasting in the Narnia books and what it symbolizes. Sometimes feasting is good and sometimes it is bad. I like the symbolism of open feasting being associated with good and secret feasting being associated with bad. It's similar to Proverbs 1 and 2. Negatives, there's some pacing issues in this book. The info dumping was a little jarring compared to the other books. C.S. Lewis is a serial info dumper. Usually that's not a problem for me for some reason because it's just such a good story, but I found myself meandering and wandering a little bit when I was reading this one, and there are some sexist remarks about the Telmarine women. I would still recommend this book for both adults and kids, just read it with a critical eye and or with your kids. Next up is The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. I read this book in December, and I'm going to make a separate video on it. This is a story about two kids who rescue King Caspian's son from the hands of a powerful green witch with the help of a frogman. Positives. I loved Jill's character arc and Puddleglum's. There's great world building in this book as well. and high stakes and a truly intimidating antagonist. I think that this might be my favorite antagonist in the series. Negatives. There are some sexist remarks here and there. It's implied that the head of Experiment House is a bad head of Experiment House because she's a woman. That's kind of a bad idea. And the antagonist has zero backstory. She's intimidating, but there's nothing really said about who she is or where she came from, making her inferior to Jadis in my opinion, even though I personally like her a lot more than Jadis. Nevertheless, I highly recommend this book. I will go into more detail on this book later and make a separate video on it. Next is The Mystery, Finding True Love in a World of Broken Lovers by Lacey Sturm. I read this in August. As said before, this book is way better at tackling the issue of idolatry than Counterfeit Gods was. This is a memoir about Lacey Sturm's struggle with an emotional affair and the things God taught her through that experience. I'm a huge fan of Lacey Sturm and her musical work, especially with Flyleaf. I listen to Flyleaf religiously, and I will make a separate glowing video of this one because it changed my life this year. Let's talk about the positives. There's incredible storytelling. It's as good as her songwriting, overall really good messages about codependency, idolatry, abuse, and fatherhood. I like how she tackles the idea of her struggle with seeing God as her heavenly father. That's very relatable to me. Negatives. Some very harmful, uncritical endorsements of purity culture books, such as Passion and Purity by Elizabeth Elliot and the Bride Wore White. These books have caused a ton of damage in the dating world. She has a lot of Josh Harris, I kiss dating goodbye things. Obviously, as a memoir, you can't criticize things that actually happen, so my problem isn't the mention of them, it is, as usual, the framing. Her framing is a little bit too positive without mentioning that this could really hurt someone and that you're better off avoiding it, statistically speaking. I would still recommend the book, but use your brain. That's the motto of this video, is use your brain. Alright, our final 4-star is Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. I reread this book in March, but the first time I read it, I was in the ER in 2021, so I didn't remember very much about it. This is a book about a sad old guy who redeems himself by the power of self-forgiveness and change. I loved this book. It got me through so much in 2021, so let's talk about the positives. First positive, I love Dalinar's arc, same with Kaladin's. They both go through so much transformation in this story, and Shallan ended up being a great, at the time, unintentional portrayal of DID. I believe that Brandon Sanderson didn't originally intend that for her, but later on when he realized how many people with DID were benefiting from it, he adjusted the lore a little bit to reflect that. I felt that that was very respectful of him, and I admire him as a writer and a person. World building is as stellar as ever in this book. I love the world of Roshar. I love the Cosmere. Odium's introduction was so spectacular. And that climax. This book has one of the best payoffs. It is a close tie with Wind and Truth, and I absolutely loved it. But there are some negatives as well. Yasna's re-entry into the story is a little bit awkward. I think that that was kind of the point, so I don't know if I would consider this a negative, but I think that it is a bit of a problem for me personally, and it messed with the pacing. That was very slow and awkward. The pacing is super janky in Oathbringer. That did not get better on my second read. The payoff is amazing, but I think that the journey to get there is a little bit of a slog. That being said, I recommend this book. I recommend it especially on audio. I think that it is easier to digest on audio, and I think that you will enjoy it. Alright, now we get into the 5-star books. These are books that I totally enjoyed all the way through. No book is perfect, but the flaws in these books did not detract from my overall enjoyment of them. The first book on this list, or rather series of books, is the Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I reread these in the summer. I first read them probably back in 2019. I have the same rating for all of them, which is 5 stars, so I'm reviewing them together. This is a series and a story about what happens when the revolutionaries in a fantasy world win against the big bad, the villain, the God King. I will make a longer video on these books later, assuming that it hasn't been done to death. In the meantime, let's talk about the positives. The characters are also relatable, they're very three-dimensional. The triple lead of Sazed, Vin, and Elend is phenomenal. They have such great chemistry together, and all of them have really good character arcs. Everything is just what I needed when I needed it, and I cried at the end of Hero of Ages twice, both times that I read it. This does not feel like a generic fantasy read either. It has a very unique magic system, a very unique world and political system, and I like how technology is just as advanced as ours, just in different ways. Scadrial's medicine is apparently better than ours. There are a lot of good themes about codependency in this book and in this series, and I really liked it. Honestly, it was really hard to think of negatives for these books. Well of Ascension is a little bit slow at times, and I'm not totally sure what Brandon Sanderson was trying to communicate with Vin taking up preservation and then fighting Ruin. I'm also not sure what is meant by "you killed my last reason to live." That line, that's a little bit strange. None of this ruins the story, though. I would highly recommend this series, and I really enjoyed it. Next book on the list is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I read this in March. This is a story about how a princess falls in love with a scary god king who is actually a massive sweetheart. Positives. I am a sucker for a scary man who really loves his wife. That trope is really awesome and phenomenal. I love the deconstruction of the martyr complex with Vivenna, and as always, the world building in this book is spectacular. The royal locks are super interesting. I like the idea of hair color changing based on your emotions. I think that that's beautiful. There's not really a lot of negative to speak of on this book either. Not a lot of falling action at the end, though, but apparently it's the first in a series, so I don't think that that's a huge problem. Either way, didn't detract from my enjoyment. Favorite Cosmere novel, do check it out. Next up is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. I reread this book in December and absolutely loved it. This is the story of King Caspian and three human children setting out to find the lost lords who were loyal to his father but exiled by Miraz. This is probably my second favorite Narnia book, with the first one being The Magician's Nephew or The Last Battle. It's super hard to decide between all the books in the Narnia series. Positives. I loved Caspian in this book. Caspian is one of my favorite characters besides Tyrion in The Last Battle. This book is very humorous, it's very funny, and I like the little poking fun at Eustace thing. Speaking of Eustace, Eustace has a great character arc, and this book is worth reading just for that alone. Negatives. I don't know if this is technically a negative, but the book feels very episodic at times. I don't mind this personally. I'm an episodic writer. I like episodic shows and readings, but someone else might have a problem with it since it does change the pacing a little bit. I'm also a bit conflicted on Reepicheep's ending. I recognize that C.S. Lewis was likely trying to go for a Philippians 2 sort of situation, and it didn't quite land for me. I'm not totally sure how to articulate it. Maybe I will make a video on it later. Nevertheless, I didn't find myself being distracted by any of these errors, and I found that I could enjoy the story super well. It's a great Narnia book. Go and read it. Next up is The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. I read this book in November. This is a satirical work in which an experienced demon teaches his young nephew about how to send people to hell. Let it not be said that I can't give C.S. Lewis a 5-star. This is an amazing book. I'm going to make a separate video on this later because I think that it is still very relevant for today. The theology is really deep in this book. That's the first positive. It's very deep compared to a lot of the scaremongering of other books on the same topic of spiritual warfare. The characters are also hilarious. I really liked the character of Screwtape. He is very funny. I love the part where he gets so mad at Wormwood that he turns into a giant centipede and his assistant has to finish the letter for him. This story also made me more aware of spiritual warfare and, as always, the hidden dangers that a lot of books don't really cover. This book is not full of religious scrupulosity or anything that could trigger that, and I found that very comforting throughout the entire thing. The only negative I would say is present in the book, and this may not be a negative depending on who you are, is that this book is very old. It was written during World War II, and obviously there's a lot of outdated British language and British culture that's referenced in this book because C.S. Lewis is a British person. And I didn't have a problem with any of this because I was reading on Kindle, and Kindle has a great function where you can look up the meanings of words on the go without any extra legwork. But somebody reading a paper copy or an audio copy might be a little bit confused by that. Kind of depends on who you are. I recommend this book. It is awesome. Go and check it out. And now we have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I reread this book in November, and I remember it best of the Narnia stories because it's the most popular, and also the movie is a lot better than the one for Prince Caspian and the one for The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I can't believe I didn't mention the movie of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. That one, whew, that one's interesting. This is a story about how redemption is expensive and how the good guys ultimately win. This book is phenomenal. It holds up really well. Edmund's arc is pretty awesome. The emphasis on feasting, as always, is super great. In this book, feasting with Mr. Tumnus is actually a bad thing because it happens in a secret place, harkening back, as I said earlier, to Proverbs 1 and 2. Jadis also feels truly intimidating. I love her in all the books she appears in, and I think that her whole thing is very interesting. There's only one negative, and again, this might not be a negative depending on who you are and how you think and interpret the story. Some of the biblical parallels, if they are intended as such, they don't hold up very well, such as Aslan making a deal with the witch that whoever is a traitor falls into her hand and is basically abandoned by Aslan. This sort of thing is not scriptural. It's very strange to me that Jadis would have that sort of power over Aslan in that way and the Emperor over the Sea. But I do recognize that Jadis isn't literally Satan, whereas Aslan is literally Jesus. So take that as you will. You don't have to read it as a one-to-one parallel or a repetition of the biblical narrative in order to enjoy this. I do recommend this book. I don't think that flaw detracts from it. It's just something to keep in mind. Next up is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I reread this book in February and loved it. As always, I read it for the first time in 2021. This is the story of how self-pity is not the way to go and how complacency has deadly consequences. Positives. The world building blows me away every time. I love the world of Roshar, as I said earlier, with Oathbringer and Win and Truth. I like how everything is introduced. It feels slow enough that it's not too distracting. I love the main character's arcs all the way through. I especially liked Shallan's. She's very relatable to how I was whenever I was her age. The climax and the resolution are also to die for. That epic moment when Dalinar and Adolin are abandoned by Sadeas and Kaladin and Bridge 4 have to come and save them. That left me on the edge of my seat every time. And it's even cooler if you listen to the Black Piper's Kaladin record. I will leave a link to that in the description for you. A couple of negatives, some pacing issues, not as bad as when I first read. I think a lot of it is that there's a lot of world building, and sometimes in an epic fantasy that can feel overwhelming. There are also some very confusingly similar names to keep track of on a first time read, but I'm a complete hypocrite with that because I have Adora and Allura and Carmen and Catra in my She-Ra fanfiction series. Overall, highly recommend this book, really liked it, and I recommend the rest of the Stormlight books as well. And now we have Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell by Brandon Sanderson. I tried to read the entire Cosmere in a year. That didn't really pan out. I got burnout, but I will finish it in 2026. I read this book in March, and this is a story about how sometimes even terrible people can give you survival skills and teach you good things. The world building, as always, is awesome. The name Threnody is super fun to say, and it's worth reading this short story just for that alone. I'm chomping at the bit for more from this world. I hope it will be written soon. Sometimes it was difficult to connect to Silence because of the story's brevity, but that didn't take me very much out of the story as well. I do recommend the story, especially if you're a fan of the Cosmere. I think it is a decent entry point into the world of the Cosmere if you want something short, sweet, and maybe cheap. Next is Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. I read this in May and June. This is a story about a captured tower, a pair of doomed scholars, and the tides of life's fortunes and falls. I will make this into a separate video because this book changed my life twice, once in 2021 and once this year. Positives. Shallan and Kaladin have a software update, so does Navani. Navani's my favorite Stormlight character. I really loved getting to see her shine in this book. The Pursuer is a truly intimidating foe. He is very interesting, and the things that he represents as far as Kaladin's mental health go are very underappreciated. Negatives. Conflicted on Raboniel's death. I don't know if it counts as redemption by death, but the story seems to frame it as redemptive in some way because Navani calls her a hero. I'm not a huge fan of that. That's a little bit weird. Dalinar also takes a backseat. That's not the end of the world, but it is the first time that a major character, a lead in Stormlight, has done so. I recommend this book. It is a great one. It is my favorite Stormlight book, probably, so I hope you enjoy it too. Next, we have I Am Malala, the girl who stood up for education and was shot by the Taliban by Malala Yousafzai. I read this in September. This is a memoir by, as the title suggests, an education rights activist from Pakistan who witnessed the Taliban take over her country. She's only 6 years older than me. That's insane. I will make a separate video on this book because this was really eye-opening for me. We really need to touch grass here in the West, Gen Z and Gen Alpha and whoever came after them. Positives. I loved listening to a peaceful Muslim's perspective on Islamic terror. I don't agree with her perspective, obviously. I'm a Christian, and that alone will not stop me from enjoying listening to somebody talk about their experiences. There are a lot of powerful messages in this book that anyone can learn regardless of their faith, and some very true things about God, even though it is a false God. She opened my eyes a lot to what true corruption is as well versus our first world corruption in the West. You don't know what true corruption is like until you read this book. It's wild. There are a couple of negatives. Malala seems not to understand Islam very well. All Sunni and Shiite schools, all major ones at least, they call for the killing of apostates. The only thing they disagree on is what circumstances that can be done under, for example. Islam, the main branches at least, are not a religion of peace. Sometimes the story is a little confusing as well, and she will jump between topics a little too quickly. For my taste, it was a little bit confusing and jarring sometimes. Overall, though, this book is very good. The flaws don't detract from it at all. I think that her perspective is valuable and that she does amazing things in the world even today. Next up is Toilet Bound Hanako-kun, volumes 20 to 23. I'm going to be reviewing these together because they're quite short. I read these in October, and by the way, manga reads very well on Kindle, just so you know. This series is about a girl who falls in love with a ghost and has to deal with all the complexities of that. I'd make a video on this series, but I don't want to do it till the manga concludes. I learned the hard way with My Hero Academia that you can't really judge a manga until it's finished. Positives. I love the Hanako-kun anime so much. The story is fantastic so far. I also love the manga. I think that both do an incredible job in their own ways. I'm a sucker for older woman and younger man, so Hananene also fills my soul. Volume 23 also ends on an interesting cliffhanger. We have adult Yugi Amane, aka Hanako, with his little brother Tsukasa, who is still a child. There are a couple of negatives. I'm not really sure what Tsukasa kissing Nene was supposed to accomplish. It just seems like she's being treated as a cheap possession by the narrative, and I don't like fan service. I recognize that it's portrayed as wrong in the story, but if it's a cheap and contrived way to further the plot, that's a little bit strange. I wish I could go into more detail on this, but those are my off-the-cuff thoughts. I'm also not sure how I'm supposed to read Ko and Mitsuba, whether they're supposed to be healthy or unhealthy. Obviously, they are unhealthy objectively, just very codependent and everything, and I'm tempted to think that that's the point because it's obviously intended to be the point with Nene and Hanako right now. I can't really knock this too hard since I'm not caught up on the story and it's not over yet, but that's my current thought on it. I do recommend this series and this manga. It is very nice. Next up, we have Mistborn, the 11th Metal by Brandon Sanderson. I read this book in August. This is a story about Kelsier training with Gimel. This was mentioned in Mistborn, the Final Empire, so I was curious to read this prequel. It is a brief story. It is an actual short story and not a novella disguised as a short story. Kelsier is, as always, the mascot of Mistborn, and there's a lot of intrigue and a good prequel for the main series. You can indeed read this before the Final Empire. This might be another entry point into the Cosmere if you want something cheap and aren't sure if you want to invest in a whole book. The only negative I have is that sometimes the brevity can make the story feel a bit too offhanded. Brandon Sanderson actually does best with epic fantasy, and this was a similar problem I had in Wax and Wayne, where something interesting would be mentioned, but there wasn't enough time to actually explore it in that book. So sometimes the brevity can feel a little bit disappointing, but this is still a worthy read, and I highly recommend it. Next up, we have The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. I reread this book in November, but it was functionally a first-time read because I read it last when I was 7, as I have mentioned before with the other Narnia books. This is a story about two kids who go to another world. It's not an isekai, though, and have to save the boy's mother with a silver apple. This is probably the best Narnia book, but it's close with The Voyage of the Dawn Treader and The Last Battle for me. The Last Battle is such a good book, guys. I can't wait to review it in this video. Positives. The questions it poses about Charn, the wood between the worlds, and the nature of the magic rings are so interesting. There's infinite fanfiction potential, which is a compliment coming from me. I really like this book, especially the things with Jadis and with her homeland, and the way that she just impacts and permeates the entire story. Diggory's hero's journey is also very important, and it is very interesting, and I think that he does the formulaic hero's journey quite well. Not really any negatives to speak of. This book is pretty awesome. Alright, next up is The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. I read this book on the tail end of December. This is the final Narnia book, and it serves to symbolize the end times according to Christianity. I will make a separate video discussing it because there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about. Positives. The climax is spectacular. It is very eerie. It is very wonderful and interesting. Tyrion is probably the best native Narnian character in this. Tash feels truly intimidating as a character as well, although in the light of Aslan he pales. Some might say that's a deus ex machina, but considering Aslan is literally Jesus, I think I can let it slide. The only other thing I have to say, and this is more a rebuttal to the negativity, is that I'm not sure why Susan's situation is thought of as sexist by a lot of readers. I found it to be very realistic and like she was getting into Hollywood and things like that, which even back when Lewis was writing, Hollywood was debaucherous and it is filthy. They were terrible people then, many of them are terrible people now. That's not out of the question. C.S. Lewis never says that Susan is wrong to like nylons and lipstick. He has a problem with her only liking those things. And yes, there are some people who think the meaning of life is fashion and cosmetics and being young and feeling young and having all these experiences that are pleasurable but ultimately empty. There are only a couple of negatives for this book. While not intentionally or consciously racist, some comments about the Calormians haven't aged all that well. Some of the theology is a little bit confusing and or not exactly correct, but I'm not sure if that's because of poor phrasing or actual incorrectness. I'll go into more detail on this, but there's a point where Aslan implies that he cannot do something, whereas he's literally supposed to be Jesus, and that's a little bit strange to me. Next up, we have Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, a devout Muslim encounters Christianity by Nabil Qureshi. I reread this book in December. I first read it in 9th or 10th grade, so about 7 or 8 years ago. This is a memoir by a man who converted from Ahmadiyyat Islam to Christianity. This book really inspired Carmen's arc in Starwalker, so I will make a separate video on that and on the book as a whole. So many positives to speak of. Messaging and storytelling made me laugh out loud. I am a huge fan of his friend David Wood. That's actually how I found David Wood, is by reading Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and then getting into David's channel. It was very informative on Islam. I hope that you will benefit because I'm leaving David's channel down in the description below. As far as positives go, this also gives a good glimpse into the lay Muslims' experience and belief system compared to that of their scholars and holy texts. Most Muslims live far better lives than their holy texts command them to, both the Quran and the Hadith and the Sirat and everything else. This also has a good theology of suffering compared to Lutzer's book. I think that Nabil emphasizing that he is able to have pleasure and freedom and joy in Christ is something that Lutzer was really missing in his book. He didn't have the martyrdom complex and the seeking out of martyrdom experiences that Lutzer had. He was a little bit into what Lutzer was criticizing, but then he learned from it and grew from it and had a more balanced perspective than either Lutzer or the people he was critiquing. There are no negatives to speak of in this book that I can think of. I can only think that some people might criticize it because Nabil, while he was alive, was part of RZIM. I've already addressed Ravi earlier in this video. I won't do it again. I highly recommend this book. I think that it is interesting, and if nothing else, even if you disagree with his view on Islam, you can benefit from reading a guy's story Next is Mistborn Secret History by Brandon Sanderson. I read this book in August, and this is a story about what all Kelsier was doing during the events of the Mistborn books, specifically after he died in the Final Empire. I told you there were going to be spoilers. Sorry. Positives: fills in a lot of gaps and questions left by the main series, gives Vin a better send-off, and it ends on a very interesting cliffhanger. This cliffhanger is picked up in Stormlight, specifically books 2 to 5, and I thought that was really cool. Negatives: it was a little bit disjointed with a lot of time gaps, although I can't fault the author very much because he has said as such in interviews that it was very hard to write. Doesn't detract from the experience at all, still highly recommend. Next is Edge Dancer by Brandon Sanderson. I read this in March. This is a story about the character Lift from the Stormlight Archive and her journey of growing up. Positives: I liked Lift a little more in this book than I did in the main series. She is still not my favorite character, but I got an interesting glimpse into her thoughts in her head. There's also an interesting reference to the Sleepless that I didn't catch, and I didn't notice it until I read Dawn Shard and then was like, oh yeah, that's a thing, isn't it? Her arc and Nails as well are pretty awesome, and I liked the climax of the story, how she embraces this old, immortal loser, and she finally begins to accept that she's growing up. Negatives: like I said, Lift is not my favorite Stormlight character. I think that this book satisfies Lift fans. She's not my favorite. Her interactions with Wendell are a little bit cyclical and obnoxious to me, but this is a personal preference thing. I don't really know how to put my finger on it or what I would change, so I'm not going to bash it too much. Overall, highly enjoyed this book. I hope that you will too. Next up is Street Smarts: Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges by Greg Koukl. I read this book in October. This book is a companion to Tactics and largely applying the methods used in that book. Positives: Greg's matured a lot beyond Tactics and uses much better examples in this book overall. I think he caused less needless division in this book than he did in Tactics. These are the challenges most people will level at Christianity on a daily basis, so it works for the average person. Negatives: still not perfect on the examples, and these are not the toughest challenges that could be leveled at Christianity, just the most common ones, so the title might be a little misleading. This is good for people just getting into evangelism and listening to people they disagree with and engaging them in respectful conversation. But if you're looking for something deeper, I would check out a different scholar like William Lane Craig. Very much like this book, highly recommend. And now we have How to Read the Bible Like a Seminary Professor by Mark M. Yarbrough. I read this in July. This is a book about how to study the Bible through the 4 steps of observation, interpretation, correlation, and application. So many positives to speak of, very approachable for beginners who want to get into Bible study. It helped me break it down into manageable parts, even though I have ADHD and hate studying. Mark Yarbrough is also an incredible writer. He has a lot of humorous stories about his sons. I loved the story when Jacob drank gasoline at the gas station and he had like gasoline burps for a week and gasoline farts and all. I recommend this book. I don't agree with all of his views and his applications of the methods and his interpretations. That is not a negative, that is called being human. Sixth of the Dusk by Brandon Sanderson. I read this in May. This is the story about a hunter whose trade is becoming obsolete in the world and about his journey of accepting this reality. I am going to read Emberdark in 2026. I had Sanderson burnout after Mistborn and Stormlight and Warbreaker, and the idea of magical birds is really interesting to me. I feel like it hasn't been done in this way before, and so that was pretty new and exciting. I love Dusk's character and what he represents as well, with the obsolete society, the technological inferiority, and the risks and challenges that that poses. I got a lot of like US military versus Native American in the 1800s kinds of vibes in the best possible way. Space opera stuff is also super cool, like I said, that kind of gets back to the technological inferiority stuff. I can't really think of any negatives for this book. I'm just really excited to read Emberdark in 2026. And now we have With My Eyes Wide Open, Miracles and Mistakes on My Way Back to Corn by Brian Hudd Welch. I read this in March. This is the sequel to Save Me From Myself, about being a single dad and eventually rejoining Corn to reach people with the gospel. Lots of positives. Welch has really found his voice, and the weird theology doesn't exist in this book. That's actually the reason why I don't fault the previous one too much, is because he's learned and grown so much from it. This is a powerful story told in a very powerful way, and he has an interesting theology of foul language. I don't have agreements with all of it, but it is much better than the stance that a lot of Christians take. A lot of Christians' views of foul language would make it so that God is sinning. I can't think of any negatives, so I would recommend this book. Next up is Dawn Shard by Brandon Sanderson. We're almost done, guys. I read this in May. This is a story about the side character Rhys and how she becomes powerful enough to kill a god. Positives. I didn't like Rhys much in the main series, so exploring her was very nice in this book. I think that she's an interesting character. I love the exploration of disability as a disabled person myself. I love her chemistry with Neekly. I had to look up his name though because I'm missing memories. The lore of the Dawn Shard was also awesome. I'm not totally sure what it is yet, even after reading this book and Wind and Truth, but there is something very mysterious and intriguing and ancient about it. So that's pretty awesome. Can't really think of any negatives for this book, so I'm just going to end it here and recommend it, but we still have one more book to go, which is The Reason: How I Discovered a Life Worth Living by Lacey Sturm. That is a tongue twister. I struggled to say that. I read this book in August. This is about Lacey's testimony and how she came to know Jesus from the demonic hard rock culture she grew up in. I am a huge fan of Lacey's work once again. I will make a separate video on this and Sad Kid Syndrome later on because I think it's very interesting. We need to explore that more in our culture because Gen Z and Gen Alpha severely suffer from it. Positives. She dissects Sad Kid Syndrome and Darkness is Honesty very well. I really, really liked this book when it came to that. It was very healing as somebody who struggled with that as a teenager. There's amazing messaging and storytelling overall, and a biblical sexual ethic on same-sex attraction, which Lacey struggled with. I can't believe I have to list this as a positive, but there you go. No negatives on this one. I highly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. And there you have it. These are the books that I've read in 2025. I will be making separate videos on some of these books, so please subscribe and hit the bell if you're curious or salty or interested in my longer thoughts. Thank you for watching. Please give me validation. Please like this video. Please comment and subscribe once again. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.